Well, last week's video on John 1:1 and the proper translation of it, in contrast with the Watchtower Society of the Jehovah's Witnesses, has gotten a lot of interest. And so I've decided to do a follow-up video looking at another area that has some relevance to this question of the deity of Christ, that most important question, where Jehovah's Witnesses will deny the deity of Christ, say that Jesus was not in fact God, but was merely a powerful, glorious, angelic being who has been exalted through his obedience to God the Father. Well, again, last week we looked at John 1:1 and tried to dig out what the original language meant when it says that the Word, as our translations would say, the Word was God. Well, this week I want to look at a different issue, which is the question of whether or not Jesus received worship. Well, obviously that's a very important question to ask as we consider whether Jesus was God, because the Bible is very, very clear that we should only ever worship God. And Jehovah's Witnesses would agree with that, which is why they say that Jesus, who they do not believe is God, should not be worshipped. And in fact, they would say he was not worshipped at any point in his life, during, as recorded in the New Testament Gospels. So it would seem, at first glance, if you look in your New Testament, as if this is an easy question to solve. After all, we have many verses which say that Jesus was worshipped. But if you watched last week's video, you probably know what I'm about to say, which is that the Watchtower Society, in their version of the Bible, the New World Translation, they simply translate those verses differently. And they say, in fact, that Jesus was not receiving worship, and that our versions of the Bible are the ones with the mistranslations. That, in fact, Jesus was simply receiving obeisance, they would say. Basically acts of respect. Well, to dig out what's really going on in these verses, we need to look at, once again, the original word that's used in the Greek manuscripts that both we and the Jehovah's Witnesses would be referencing as we write our English versions that you and I would read today. Well, generally, the word that is translated worship in the New Testament is a Greek word that is, in the Greek, proskuneo. Proskuneo. If you want to dig a little bit on your own, this word is in the Strong's Concordance, word number 4352. If you just look that up in the Strong's Concordance, it'll get you a list of what it means, all the verses where it appears, and its various forms. Of course, just like in English, you might have worship, worshipped, worshipping, things like that. Similarly, proskuneo appears in a few forms, but ultimately, that's the word we're looking at when we read about someone being worshipped in the New Testament. Well, what makes things a little bit complicated is that proskuneo does not always mean worship in a religious sense. Ultimately, the word actually goes back to sort of means an act of kissing. It's related to kissing, which in the old, ancient cultures was a sign of respect. And then it changed a great deal, from that root. And ultimately, by the time of the New Testament in Greek, this word would basically mean either paying someone respect, doing obeisance, bowing before them, or worshiping. Now, generally, it meant worship, but not always. You can think of it sort of like this. In English, the phrase to sleep with, literally, it means just to be asleep near. But obviously, today when we say somebody slept with someone else, we know it means something a good deal more than just sleeping. That the word has gone from a physical meaning to, a connotation that wasn't originally attached to it. That's sort of what happened to proskuneo over time, as it goes from a physical, word related to kissing out of respect to ultimately then this word that means either worship or just, bowing before somebody with, respect, showing obeisance to them. Well, what the Jehovah's Witnesses would say is that when we see in the New Testament Jesus receiving proskuneo, and he does repeatedly, dozens of verses. Again, if you look it up in a concordance listing these verses, dozens of times in the Gospels, a couple instances in Hebrews, in Revelation, these multiple references to Jesus receiving proskuneo. Now, by itself, that's suggestive. Because, as I said, generally when we encounter the word proskuneo, that word means worship. Let me just give you a few examples. In Matthew 4, 9, and 10, this one is particularly suggestive, in that that's the story of Jesus being tempted by Satan in the wilderness. And if you recall, Satan's third temptation to Jesus was to worship him, to proskuneo him. And Jesus responds in Matthew 4:10 by saying, quoting the Bible, to say that, no, you shall only proskuneo God himself. So Satan demands worship, and Jesus says, no, we should only worship God the Father, and uses this word proskuneo. In John 4:20 through 23, the woman at the well asks Jesus where they should worship God. Plainly, she's talking about worship. And Jesus then replies, understanding her question, telling her how to worship God. In Acts 7:43, Stephen accuses the Jews of idolatry, worshiping false idols, using the word proskuneo. In Acts 24:11, Paul testifies that he went up to Jerusalem to proskuneo at the temple. In fact, throughout Revelation, you have repeated use of this word, describing the idolatrous false worship of the beast in these various accounts of the end times. So you have very plainly, very often, in fact, we could say usually, in the New Testament, proskuneo, when we encounter it, is talking about worship, not simply some sort of reverential, respect or doing obeisance. Well, furthermore, because of this significance of proskuneo usually meaning worship, we actually interestingly encounter it a couple times where people reject proskuneo because they recognize that only God should be worshipped. In Acts 10, you have Peter coming to the household of Cornelius to share the gospel. And when he arrives, Cornelius is so overcome with joy that he proskuneos before Peter. And Acts 10, 25 and 26 tells us that Peter lifted Cornelius back up and said, no, stand up. I too am a man. Now you might say, well, but Jehovah's Witnesses and we would agree that Jesus is more than just a man. Jehovah's Witnesses would say Jesus was an exalted angel. Maybe it's okay to proskuneo an exalted angel? Well, fortunately, in Revelation 22, we have an example of exactly that. In a vision, John goes before a heavenly angel, a heavenly being, and he is overcome, like Cornelius before Peter, bows in awe. We're told he proskuneos. And the angel immediately reacts fairly violently. No, don't worship me. I am but a messenger. I am but a servant. And lifts John up. It says, only proskuneo God. So the apostles of God, don't proskuneo them. The angels of God, don't proskuneo them. And yet, throughout the New Testament, throughout the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we have repeated examples of us being told that Jesus was proskuneoed, that he received this thing, this act, which is, in these examples, plainly worship. For example, and this is just a few examples, again, look in the Strong's Concordance, like I said, number 4352, if you want to do your own research, see these verses for yourself, and again, many more than I can list here. But just taking a few examples, in Matthew 2, when the wise men arrive in Bethlehem, having come to see the baby Jesus, we're told they proskuneo him. In Matthew 14:33, when you have the calming of the sea, the disciples are overcome by Jesus calming the stormy sea, and they proskuneo him. In John 9:34, when Jesus has healed the man born blind. Once he finds Jesus, we're told he proskuneos Jesus. So you have multiple examples, and there's one more that I want to mention specifically, but we'll come back to it in a moment. But many, many examples in the New Testament of Jesus receiving this thing, which usually, but not always, means worship. Well, what the Jehovah's Witnesses have to argue is that every one of these instances is not worship, but just a sort of reverential, respectful bowing down. Which is interesting because in the other uses of the word in the New Testament, it generally means worship. And I think the first point we can make is simply that this is very careless of God, apparently. You know, if you think of words that have loaded significance, loaded connotations, again, go back to the word that I said, to say that you slept with somebody. So suppose that I was on a church camping trip, and there was some woman whose tent happened to be near my family's tent, and then I later said that I slept with that woman. You obviously would never say that, because you realize in our culture that even though I suppose literally that would be true, there's a whole lot of connotation wrapped up in those words. So you would use some other word to describe what's happening to avoid giving the wrong impression. Well, then why would the New Testament, inspired by God, repeatedly tell us that Jesus received this loaded word that usually means worship? Especially if you think about the fact that according to a Jehovah's Witness, you and I who do worship Jesus are guilty of idolatry. We're worshiping somebody who should not be worshipped. Why would the New Testament, again, inspired by the Holy Spirit, why would the New Testament use a word which encourages that idolatry by making it sure look like Jesus is being worshipped? That's the first question that I think has to be considered by a Jehovah's Witness as they ask themselves, what is happening with Jesus here? If it's just respectful obeisance, just respectful bowing, man, that's a very misleading thing that we're being told in the scriptures. But it actually is even more compelling than that. Remember I said there was one more example where Jesus receives proskuneo that I want to consider. And this, I think, is conclusive. This is the icing on the cake to prove that beyond a doubt, Jesus is receiving worship, that worship which we agree should only be given to God the Father, or God the Son, in Jesus' case. And this is in Luke 24:52. And this describes Jesus' ascension back into heaven. I want to read it to you just to make sure we're all clear on what's happening here. So we're told this is at the very end of the Gospel of Luke. Starting Luke 24, we'll go Luke 24:50. And he led them out as far as Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he was blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. So notice he's been carried up into heaven. Now Luke 24:52. This is, of course, not the New World Translation. This is the New American Standard Version. So Jehovah's Witnesses are going to debate this translation, and I'll recognize that, and we'll consider which translation makes more sense in a second. But here's what my translation says for Luke 24:52. And they, after worshiping him, returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And of course, that word worshiping is proskuneo. That's the root. So they do this thing, proskuneo, which either usually means worship or may sometimes mean bowing down with great reverence. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. So they do this thing, and Jehovah's Witnesses would agree that's the Greek word that's used. They would translate it in the New World Translation as they did obeisance to him. But picture this scene for a moment for me, if you would. Again, there's two meanings to proskuneo. One is worship, like Paul went to Jerusalem to worship God. God didn't have to physically, bodily be present there because worship can be offered anywhere. Again, we worship in spirit. The other meaning is a bowing down reverentially, respectfully before an honored person. Now picture the scene. Jesus has been with his disciples. He has taught them, he has blessed them. He says, okay, time to go. And he ascends into heaven. Then they proskuneo him. Think about it. Either they've lost their minds and they're bowing down before somebody who's not actually there, or they're worshiping. Just as they're worshiping in all the other examples, when we're told throughout the New Testament that Jesus Christ received proskuneo, worship. That is the appropriate response when you encounter God in the flesh, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, our Savior, and our God.